History as we know it is written by the victors. So what happens in a war where the outcome isn't really important for either side? Well, it tends to be forgotten about, which is what seems to have happened with the War of 1812. A conflict between the British Empire and the recently formed United States of America, the war began over not much more than a few disputes over trade and lingering resentment from the American Revolution, and ended once both sides had realised they had little to gain from this expensive war, which seemed to be bound for an arduous stalemate anyway. Both sides will claim a victory, although historians tend to agree that America gained more from the conflict. However, what is possibly the most impactful outcome from the war was the fact that the British Empire managed to invade Washington DC, the only time this has happened since the Revolutionary War, and whilst they were there, burned down half the city, notably including the Capitol and the White House. 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, or as we know it, the White House, has been the official residence of every president of the United States since John Adams, who was the second president for those that you don't know. The building was designed by architect James Madison, who was Irish born, and modelled it on Leinster House in Dublin. Ever since its creation, it has stood as a monolith representing the strength of the country itself and the power of the person who resides within it. However, that wasn't the case for a short time due to some pesky British buggers during the War of 1812. As I said in the intro, the War of 1812 was a conflict fought between the British Empire and the United States, alongside each of their allies, which for the British Empire was Spain and Canada. Meanwhile, America's main ally in the conflict was France, who were absolutely the Yoko Ono of this situation. See, there's no one outright reason why the war broke out, rather several little ones, and somehow France managed to get themselves involved in a lot of them. See, since 1803, Britain and France had been engaging in Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon Bonaparte, who wasn't as short as everyone thinks, was power hungry and tried to greatly expand the French reach, which worried the British. They feared they were losing control and that Napoleon could pose a threat to their overseas colonies, which did prove to be accurate in the long run, and when Britain took the conflict to France, they weren't ready for war. Many countries waged war with Napoleon's France, however Britain was the only one who maintained the combat throughout the entire period. From the outbreak of the wars, Britain had used its superior navy to choke off neutral trade with France, which the US had contested as France were one of their top allies. Combine this with a few, air quotes, unintentional skirmishes between British and American ships, and the fact that the Empire was supplying arms to Native American tribes, and you just have a pressure cooker waiting to blow. Eyeing up the annexation of British North America, the region which now makes up Canada and the Great Lakes, on the 18th of June 1812, President James Madison declared war on the British. See, the problem Britain now faced was that their trained soldiers were all tied up battling Napoleon's France, and as such, for the War of 1812, they elected to adopt a much more defensive strategy, with their only offensive operations limited to the borders and the western frontier. They also continued to arm native groups who assisted them throughout the war. The war wasn't the smoothest for America either though, with many people opposing it, seeing it purely as a move to maintain power by Madison. The opposition was fairly justified, as whilst the US did achieve their pre-war target of defeating Tecumseh's Federation, a large alliance of North American tribes in the Great Lakes region, which they subsequently gained control over. However, all US attempts to capture parts of Canada were thwarted, and as such, the war was destined to be a stalemate virtually from the outset, with America having more manpower but being less well trained. Other than a few raids on towns on either side of the Canadian border, there was minimal movement made by either side. Well, that was the case until late August 1814, when Britain made one last assault into the American mainland, which, whilst ultimately futile, would end up having some major consequences. See, after the exile of Napoleon Bonaparte, Britain was free to use their full military power against America and move trained soldiers into combat to support the militias they'd been propping up. They were given orders to raid towns along the Atlantic coast just to draw the American forces away from the Canadian border, however were told strictly not to carry out operations inland or try and hold any towns they'd raided. Rear Admiral George Cockburn, though, was commanding a squadron in Chesapeake Bay and wrote to Vice Admiral Cochrane informing him that American defences there were weak, and several major cities, including Baltimore, Philadelphia and Washington, were vulnerable to an assault. With this information, and sparked by the wanton destruction of private property performed by American soldiers along the north coast of Lake Erie, which led residents of the Canadas to demand retaliation against the Americans, Cochrane gave the order to Cockburn, telling him, deter the enemy from a repetition of similar outrages, you are hereby required and directed to destroy and lay waste to such towns and districts as you may find assailable. He did add the caveat, to not sound too Viking-like, that they were to spare the lives of unarmed inhabitants. However, this order was frankly a rather barbaric one from the British, to perform destruction not for tactics, but for revenge and out of spite for the similar acts America had performed, though on a lesser scale. See, the British never planned to keep any of these areas, just simply to destroy them. Cockburn considered the cities which he believed to be vulnerable and elected to lead an assault on Washington due to its comparative ease of attacking and the fact that the political effects that would likely result from the capital falling were huge. With this plan set, Britain made their moves. Washington was only a few days' march away for the soldiers on land, and the naval fleets left Chesapeake Bay in separate directions, with Cochrane's fleet chasing US Commodore Joshua Barney's flotilla, which is a formation of ships smaller than a fleet, up the Patuxent River towards Maryland, and Captain James Gordon leading other ships up the Potomac River towards Washington, with the only point of conflict along the way being Fort Warburton. After the British reached Nottingham, Barney was forced to destroy his vessels to avoid them getting taken into British hands. This flotilla was all that had left General Ross hesitant to launch a full-scale attack, and with it destroyed, he set about up the Patuxent, where he could have attacked either Baltimore or Washington, which left the Americans confused. He opted for Washington, and when given a choice of routes to take, firstly made a feint towards the left to appear like he was going southwards, then quickly swerved northwards towards Bladensburg to further confuse the Americans. The news of the loss of the flotilla and the British fleet on course for Washington caused every government department to quickly pack its records and evacuate. The battle that took place at Bladensburg is seen as one of the greatest disgraces ever dealt to American arms, with a British force of Army regulars and Royal Marines completely routing a combined US force of Army and state militia troopers. The Brits were outnumbered and did suffer more casualties, however the Americans retreated, and with the militia fleeing through the streets of Washington, which sat less than 10 miles from Bladensburg, upon this defeat, President Madison, alongside practically anyone who was able to, fled Washington to escape its impending destruction. Madison fled to Brookville in Maryland, earning it the nickname the United States capital for the day. On the same day that they had defeated the Americans at Bladensburg, British forces took to the streets of Washington with the aim of razing it to the ground. Notably, the Brits first targeted the US Capitol, and prior to setting it aflame, looted the building for whatever documents and valuables lay inside. The Library of Congress, which was housed inside, was lost in the flames, and after the burning, former President Thomas Jefferson donated his private book collection to start a new library. Whilst the Capitol was their first target, it is their second which was seemingly more significant, as after the building was suitably alight, the British turned northwards up Pennsylvania Avenue towards the White House. Since Madison and First Lady Dolly had already fled to safety, the house was empty, and supposedly, British soldiers sat down and ate a meal from the leftover food before ransacking the house and setting it ablaze. With half the city on fire, you may be questioning how Washington even stands today, and the answer to this is either by a miracle, or if you're that way inclined, you may even say it was an act of God, as less than 2 days after the attack began, a heavy thunderstorm set in, which put out all the fires, as well as causing damage to the British ships which sat in the ports. The weather was so intense that a tornado which spun from it lifted 2 cannons off the ground before dropping them several yards away, killing British troops and American civilians alike. Not long after the storm had set in, British forces retreated out of Washington, and whilst it's not thought the storm caused this, as their orders were to destroy and lay waste to the city, still, the British managed to occupy Washington for about 26 hours, the only time since the American Revolution that the city has been occupied. With the fires put out, people were able to return to Washington, and whilst some may say the storms had caused more damage as they caused cracks in the foundations, the important part is that those foundations were still there and could be rebuilt. Madison never resided in the White House again, but his successor, James Monroe, moved back into the reconstructed building as early as 1817. Just before the end of the video, I'd like to address the belief that it got the nickname the White House as the walls had to be painted white to hide the fire damage. See, it is true that the term White House came into usage more commonly after the burning, but the building has always been that colour, as it was initially built using Aqua Creek sandstone painted white. And that's all for today. I hope you've all enjoyed learning about an interesting bit of history you might not have known. History really is amazing, and there's so many stories to tell, so if you enjoy this video, leaving a like and subscribing will let me know you want to see more videos like this. Comment telling me how much you knew about the War of 1812 and whether you've learned something new today. And otherwise, have an awesome time, and I'll see you in the next one.